Imagine lying on a rough wooden table. No anesthesia, no sterile tools. Just a man with a rusted blade, a bucket for your blood, and a prayer to the heavens that you don't scream too loudly. In the Middle Ages, going to the doctor was often more terrifying than the disease itself. Physicians trusted the stars more than symptoms. Surgeons doubled as barbers. And treatments ranged from bloodletting to drilling holes in your skull, all in the name of healing. What if I told you that medieval medicine wasn't just primitive, it was systematic torture, cloaked in religious doctrine and ancient pseudoscience? Over the next moments, we'll journey deep into monasteries, plague-ridden streets, asylums, and operating chambers that resembled torture dungeons. You'll see how superstition shaped diagnoses, how treatments broke more bodies than they saved, and how suffering itself was often considered a cure. This is why medieval medicine was basically torture. Let's step back into the dark corridors of history. Healers in a world of superstition. In the early medieval world, medicine existed in a strange twilight, caught between fading classical knowledge and rising religious authority. Illness wasn't understood through biology or microbes, but through divine will, astrology, and humoral imbalance. A fever might be blamed on the alignment of Mars, or on a sin that offended God. People believed that diseases were punishments, tests of faith, or even the result of demonic possession. Science, as we know it today, barely had a seat at the table. Healers in this era came in many forms: monks who copied ancient texts in cold stone monasteries, local wise women who relied on herbs and folk magic, traveling surgeons with blood-stained tools, and physicians trained on the works of Galen and Hippocrates, passed down imperfectly through generations. But even the most educated practitioners were guided by a worldview where unseen cosmic forces ruled the body. A successful treatment was as likely to involve chanting psalms as it was applying a salve. The average medieval patient had little choice but to place their fate in these hands. Rural communities often relied on folk healers, blending pagan traditions with Christian rituals. A fever might be treated by hanging amulets around the neck, burning specific herbs, or muttering incantations passed down through families. These remedies often provided psychological comfort more than actual physical relief. Still, in a world without antibiotics or germ theory, even a placebo could mean survival. At the same time, religious institutions played a powerful role in shaping medicine. Monasteries housed some of the only libraries in Europe, preserving Greek and Roman texts, but they also infused treatments with theology. Illness was often met with confession, fasting, or pilgrimages. The Church taught that suffering purified the soul, and so pain was not always something to be avoided, but sometimes deliberately prolonged. Healing and penance blurred together. Galen's shadow, ancient theories dominate. In the medieval world, few figures loomed as large over medicine as Galen of Pergamon, the 2nd century Roman physician whose works became gospel for over a millennium. Medieval doctors revered his writings as if they were holy scripture, often treating his words as infallible truths. But Galen's anatomical knowledge was largely based on animal dissections, not humans, in his theories. While sophisticated for their time, were riddled with inaccuracies, yet those errors became fixed doctrine, shaping treatments for centuries. When the Roman Empire fell, much classical knowledge vanished in Western Europe. What survived often came through Byzantine and later Islamic translations, eventually making their way back to medieval universities and monasteries. Physicians in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford pored over Galen's texts in Latin, memorizing them line by line. Rather than questioning his assumptions, they sought to fit symptoms to his theories, no matter how illogical the match. If a patient didn't recover, it was never Galen's fault. It was the patient's imbalance, or the stars. Galen taught that diseases arose from imbalances in the four humors, a theory medieval doctors clung to with religious zeal. Treatments were devised to restore balance, even if that meant weakening the patient further. Surgeons bled the sick to reduce excess blood, or induced vomiting to expel overheated bile. Rather than observing what worked in practice, physicians relied on commentaries about Galen written centuries earlier, creating a closed echo chamber of medical dogma. Challenging Galen was almost unthinkable. To contradict him was to risk professional ruin or worse, accusations of heresy. So when medieval surgeons operated with crude tools and grim determination, They did so believing they were carrying out the wisdom of the ancients. In reality, they were perpetuating errors that could mean the difference between life and death. Galen's dominance created a rigid, top-down structure in medicine. Innovation stagnated, experimentation was discouraged, and suffering continued in the name of tradition. His ghost lingered in every sick room, every bleeding, every trepanation, turning what might have been moments of care into rehearsals of ancient misconceptions. The four humors: balancing blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. Medieval medicine revolved around a single, deceptively simple idea. The body contained four fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humors were in perfect balance. Illness meant one or more had gone astray. This model shaped diagnoses and treatments for centuries, influencing everything from diet to surgery. Each humor was associated with specific temperaments, organs, and elements. Blood represented air and was linked to youth and vitality. Phlegm was cold and wet, associated with sluggishness and winter. Yellow bile brought heat and aggression, while black bile signaled melancholy and coldness. A medieval physician examining a fever might conclude that the patient had an excess of yellow bile, leading to aggressive bleeding, purging, or dietary changes. Diagnosis often depended less on symptoms and more on fitting the patient into this cosmic puzzle. If someone was pale and weak, their blood humor was likely low. If they were irritable, yellow bile was to blame. Treatments could involve changing the patient's environment, applying heated poultices, or performing procedures like bloodletting and leeching. The goal wasn't to understand disease as we do today, but to restore the body's mythical equilibrium. This theory gave medieval doctors a sense of control over the uncontrollable. In a world where plagues struck without warning and childbirth was perilous, humoral theory provided a neat framework. Unfortunately, it was medically baseless. Instead of curing infections or internal injuries, humoral treatments often weakened patients further. Someone suffering from pneumonia might be bled repeatedly until they simply didn't have the strength to breathe. The four humors persisted because they were more than a medical theory. They were a cultural worldview, linking the human body to the elements, the seasons, and the divine order. It made the universe seem orderly, even when human bodies failed. But for the suffering patient, this elegant system often translated to agonizing procedures that treated symptoms of imbalance that never truly existed. Astrology and medicine, diagnosing by the stars. Medieval physicians didn't just study the body, they studied the heavens. Astrology was a central part of medical training, and charts were drawn for nearly every major procedure. The position of the moon, planets, and zodiac signs could determine when to bleed a patient, where to make incisions, and even whether a treatment should proceed at all. The zodiac man became a common illustration in medical manuscripts, depicting a human figure covered with zodiac symbols mapped to various body parts. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Leo the heart, and so on. A physician might refuse to operate on the head if the moon was in Aries, fearing cosmic interference. Timing wasn't just superstition, it was treated as scientific scheduling. Patients might have to wait days for the right stars before being bled or cauterized, even if they were near death. Conversely, a treatment performed under an unfavorable sky was blamed for failures, not the physician's method. Astrology gave medieval medicine a veneer of cosmic legitimacy, linking suffering to divine order. Charts were drawn with meticulous care. Medieval universities even had chairs of astrology, and prominent physicians doubled as court astrologers. Noble families consulted their astrologers before surgeries, childbirths, and major medical decisions. Medicine and astrology were inseparable disciplines, united in a worldview where celestial bodies pulled the strings of health. In practice, this meant many patients' lives were dictated not by their symptoms, but by the stars' imagined will. Diseases were diagnosed through horoscopes, fevers were timed to planetary movements, and surgical calendars were set by constellations. For many, salvation, or death, came not through skill, but through the night sky. The Church takes control of the body. By the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had taken firm control of intellectual life, including medicine. Illness was seen through a theological lens. Disease could be punishment for sin, a divine test, or even demonic influence. The Church decided who could practice medicine, what knowledge was preserved, and which treatments were acceptable. Healing was often intertwined with confession, pilgrimage, and penance. Before a treatment, a patient might be told to repent or seek forgiveness, believing their soul's impurity caused their sickness. Priests played as much of a role in healing as physicians. While some diseases, especially mental illness, were attributed to possession, leading to exorcisms rather than medical interventions. The Church banned monks from performing major surgeries in the 12th century, fearing the shedding of blood was unholy. This gave rise to lay surgeons and barber surgeons, often less educated and more brutal. At the same time, monasteries remained key centers of learning, copying ancient texts but carefully filtering out anything deemed heretical. Medical knowledge was preserved but constrained. Doctors had to balance their practice with doctrine. Any idea that contradicted biblical teachings could be suppressed. Dissection, for example, was severely restricted in many regions, limiting anatomical understanding. Diseases that might have been studied scientifically were instead moralized, their causes blamed on sin or the devil. This fusion of medicine and theology created a system where suffering was normalized. Pain was seen as spiritually valuable. Enduring it patiently was virtuous. And in such a framework, brutal medical procedures could be justified as part of divine will, making torture and healing disturbingly intertwined. Monks, manuscripts, and medical monopolies. Monasteries were the intellectual strongholds of medieval Europe. Within their quiet, candlelit scriptoriums, monks painstakingly copied medical texts by hand, preserving fragments of ancient Greek and Roman wisdom. But this preservation came at a price. Knowledge was controlled. Access to these manuscripts was limited to the Church's chosen few. These manuscripts blended classical medicine, Christian theology, and folk practices. A single text might contain Galenic theories alongside prayers, recipes for herbal salves, and astrological charts. Knowledge wasn't standardized. It was a patchwork of ancient ideas and local beliefs, filtered through theological approval. This made medicine inconsistent and often dangerously experimental. Monks themselves often acted as healers, tending to both fellow clergy and lay visitors. Elastic infirmaries offered shelter and rudimentary care, but treatments were as likely to involve relics and holy water as herbs. Many monks believed their healing ability came from divine grace, not empirical skill. In this environment, questioning tradition was rare, and innovation was stifled. The Church's control meant that universities, when they emerged, operated under ecclesiastical oversight. Curricula were built on approved texts, ensuring Galen and humoral theory reigned supreme. Physicians who wished to study new ideas risked excommunication or worse. Knowledge, like medicine itself, was bound in chains of tradition. This monopoly over medical knowledge shaped European medicine for centuries. While it preserved fragments of ancient learning, it also entrenched error and slowed the growth of real science. The monasteries' libraries became both vaults of wisdom and prisons of progress, where the line between healing and holy ritual blurred into something often terrifying: bloodletting, draining life to save it. If there was one treatment that defined medieval medicine, it was bloodletting. The idea was deceptively simple. If illness came from an imbalance of the body's humors, then draining some blood would restore balance. In practice, this meant puncturing veins, slicing skin, or even plunging special knives into arteries, all without anesthesia, sterilization, or real understanding of infection. Patients were bled in homes, monasteries, and hospitals alike, from peasants to kings, because everyone believed that sickness could be flushed out like dirty water. The tools of the trade were as terrifying as the procedure itself. Physicians and barber surgeons used fleams, triangular-bladed knives to open veins in the arm, neck, or behind the ear. A brass basin was placed below to catch the flowing blood, often decorated with astrological signs indicating the best times for bleeding. Some patients were tied down to keep them from fainting or thrashing. The flow was carefully watched. Too little was considered ineffective. Too much could send a patient into irreversible shock. Timing mattered. Medieval physicians followed complex bleeding calendars, sometimes based on the zodiac, to decide which vein to open and when. A chart might say, bleed the median vein in the right arm on a waning moon in Virgo to cure fevers. If someone ignored this advice, and the patient died, the blame didn't fall on the method, but on poor timing or unfavorable stars. It's chilling to think that. Physicians could bleed a feverish child in midwinter and call it healing. For some ailments, bleeding wasn't a single event. It was repeated over weeks. A man with a lingering cough might be bled every few days until he grew pale, weak, and dizzy. For women, it was sometimes performed as a substitute for menstruation, which physicians wrongly believed was essential for maintaining humoral balance. Elderly patients were bled gently, though even that could prove fatal. Unsurprisingly, many never recovered from the cure. Perhaps the most tragic irony is that bloodletting often made illnesses worse, especially during epidemics like the plague, when weakened bodies were pushed closer to death. Yet for centuries, this ritual persisted unquestioned, its failures attributed to the stars. The patient's sins or supernatural causes, never to the blade itself. Leeches and cupping. Medieval detox when knives weren't used to draw blood. Leeches and heated cups stepped in. Leeches were a natural extension of bloodletting, squirming, slimy creatures attached to the skin to suck out bad humors. Physicians prized specific species, particularly the European medicinal leech, believing their bites were gentler and more controlled than knives. Apothecaries kept jars of them in cool cellars, ready to be applied to arms, legs, or even inside noses and mouths. The procedure began by placing leeches on warm, moistened skin, sometimes rubbed with milk to attract them. As they latched on, they injected an anticoagulant, causing blood to flow freely even after they detached. Patients could lose several ounces of blood per session, sometimes more if multiple leeches were used. If a leech wandered into a nostril or throat, it could cause choking, a horrifying but documented risk. Cupping worked differently but aimed at the same goal, drawing blood toward the surface. Practitioners heated glass or metal cups with a flame, then quickly placed them on the skin to create suction. The skin bulged and reddened, leaving large circular welts. Wet cupping involved making small incisions before applying the cups, allowing blood to be pulled out under vacuum. It was painful, often left scars, and yet was touted as a cure for everything from fevers to melancholy. These methods were not fringe practices, they were mainstream. Monks, physicians, and traveling healers alike offered leeching and cupping, sometimes as preventive measures. The wealthier the patient, the more elaborate the ritual. Some nobles wore leech bites as marks of good health, like a medieval wellness trend gone horribly wrong. The underlying belief was that the body was a vessel filled with fluids that could be regulated through external manipulation. There was no understanding of germs, circulation, or immune response. Instead, these painful methods were celebrated as detoxification, a chilling reminder that sincere belief can make brutal practices seem rational. Scarification and cauterization, burning as cure. When bloodletting and leeches failed, healers often turned to scorification and cauterization, cutting and burning the body in controlled ways to drive out disease. Scorification involved slicing the skin in patterns, sometimes dozens of shallow cuts, to let corrupt matter ooze out. This could be done on the chest for lung ailments, the abdomen for digestive issues, or the temples for headaches. Patients were sometimes restrained as the cuts were made, their blood dripping into basins as priests muttered prayers. Cauterization was even more brutal. Heated irons, sometimes shaped like branding tools, were pressed against wounds, limbs, or even veins to seal them shut or purify infected flesh. Surgeons heated rods and braziers until they glowed red, then applied them to skin, while assistants held the patient down. The smell of burning flesh filled the room, and the screams could echo through monasteries and infirmaries. This wasn't just for stopping bleeding after surgery. Cautery was used to treat infections, balance humors, and even as a diagnostic tool. In some cases, chemical cautery replaced hot irons. Substances like lye quicklime or vinegar mixed with arsenic were applied to wounds to eat away diseased tissue. This was agonizing and often fatal due to shock or poisoning, yet it was considered advanced medicine for the time, preferable to letting a wound fester without intervention. These methods reflected a deep belief in disease as an invading force that must be expelled through pain. Medieval healers thought illness could be smoked out, cut out, or burned away. The patient's endurance was part of the cure. If they survived the ordeal, it was seen as proof that the treatment worked. For modern audiences, it's difficult to imagine voluntarily submitting to such procedures. But in an era with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and no alternatives, cauterization and scarification were often seen as the only hope of survival, a desperate, fiery gamble against death. Trepanation, drilling into the skull of all medieval medical procedures. Few are as haunting as trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping holes into the human skull to treat ailments ranging from headaches to madness. While trepanation predates the Middle Ages, medieval surgeons refined it with new tools: circular tree finds with serrated edges, hand-drilled augers, and chisels. The goal was to relieve pressure, let out evil vapors, or rebalance humors trapped inside the head. Patients were often conscious during the procedure. Assistants held them down while the surgeons scraped through skin and bone, exposing the dura mater without damaging the brain beneath. There was no sterile field, no anesthesia, and often no understanding of what they were even drilling into. Blood and bone dust mingled as prayers were whispered to saints for protection. Trepanation was prescribed for head injuries, epilepsy, madness, migraines, and even spiritual possession. Some physicians believed that opening the skull allowed malevolent spirits to escape, blending medicine with exorcism. Others saw it as a mechanical fix for blocked humors, akin to opening a valve on a boiling pot. Either way, the result was a raw hole in the skull that was sometimes covered with wax or metal plates afterward. Remarkably, some patients survived these operations. Evidence of bone regrowth has been found in medieval skulls. But many did not. Infection, blood loss, and shock were common killers. And if a patient survived but did not improve, the blame fell on their sins, or astrological misalignment, not on the surgeon's hand. Trepanation reveals just how intimately medieval medicine blended brutality and belief. To them, cutting into a skull was not barbaric, but an act of healing, even if it meant literally exposing the brain to the open air. Amputations without anesthesia. When limbs became gangrenous or shattered in battle, amputation was often the only solution. But in a world before anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper surgical tools, this was a procedure of unimaginable agony. Patients were usually tied to a table while assistants held them down. The surgeon, often a barber surgeon rather than a learned physician, would use a saw or cleaver to remove the limb as quickly as possible. Speed was everything. A skilled surgeon could sever a leg in under a minute, sometimes less, to minimize suffering. But minimize was relative. The pain was excruciating, and many died from shock before the operation even finished. Once the limb was off, the stump was cauterized with a hot iron to stop bleeding. The smell of burning flesh and the screams of patients made these surgeries unforgettable for anyone who witnessed them. Infection was almost inevitable. Surgeons didn't clean their tools between patients. Saws and knives might be caked with dried blood from previous amputations. Bandages were often reused, and hospitals were breeding grounds for bacteria. Some patients survived, but many developed sepsis and died days or weeks later. Amputations weren't limited to soldiers. Farmers crushed by carts, workers injured by mill wheels, or even patients with severe frostbite could find themselves on a surgeon's table. Nobles occasionally fared better, receiving cleaner tools and more attentive aftercare, but the pain was universal. These amputations underscore how medieval medicine prioritized immediate survival over long-term recovery. The operation was meant to save a life, not restore function. Prosthetics were rudimentary, wooden peg legs or iron hooks, leaving survivors permanently maimed. Yet in a brutal world, losing a limb and living was considered a triumph. Cures for headaches and migraines. Headaches and migraines plagued medieval people just as they do today, but the treatments were far from aspirin. Physicians believed headaches were caused by excess humors accumulating in the head, so their solutions involved draining, purging, or releasing vapors. Patients might be bled from the temples or neck veins, scarified across the scalp, or subjected to trepanation if the pain persisted. Herbal remedies existed but were often secondary. Poultices made of vinegar, crushed herbs, and even pigeon dung were applied to the forehead. Some physicians prescribed smelling rancid substances like burnt hair or sulfur to shock the humors back into balance. Others recommended inhaling steam infused with herbs like lavender or sage, but the results were inconsistent. One bizarre treatment involved inserting garlic or onion into the nostrils to provoke sneezing, which was thought to expel the offending vapors. Another prescribed holding a heated iron close to the head, too. Draw out pain, a dangerously literal interpretation of burning out a headache. Some patients endured cauterization of the temples, where small red-hot irons were pressed into the skin to create blistering burns meant to distract from or cure the pain. Astrology also played a role. Headaches under certain zodiac signs were treated differently. For example, if Mars was dominant, physicians might prescribe more aggressive bleeding, whereas a Venus influence might call for gentler purges. The heavens, in their view, dictated both the origin and the cure of pain. These methods reflect how even common ailments could lead to extreme interventions. A medieval migraine wasn't just a bad day. It could end with cuts, burns, or even a hole drilled in your skull. The surgeon barbers, knives, razors, and bones. The surgeon barbers were the hands-on practitioners of medieval medicine. Part barber, part surgeon, part all trades. They shaved beards, set bones, lanced boils, extracted teeth, and performed amputations. While physicians theorized in Latin manuscripts, surgeon barbers worked in blood and sweat. Often in public squares or small shops marked by the red and white striped pole, a symbol of blood and bandages. Their training was practical rather than academic. Apprentices learned by watching and doing, not by studying Galen or astrology. This made them both invaluable and disrespected. The church and universities often looked down on them, yet when someone broke a leg or needed a tooth pulled, it was the barber surgeon who was called, not the learned physician. Surgeon barbers used razors, knives, saws, and basic clamps, often without cleaning them between procedures. They were the first line of response for battlefield injuries, applying tourniquets, cauterizing wounds, and hacking off limbs when necessary. Their shops smelled of hair oil, blood, and smoke from the irons they kept heated in braziers. Despite their reputation as butchers, many barber surgeons became highly skilled. Some developed innovative techniques for setting bones or performing quick amputations. They traveled with armies, tended to nobles, and occasionally challenged university physicians with their practical knowledge. Yet their methods remained brutal by modern standards, efficient but bloody. In a way, surgeon barbers embodied the dual nature of medieval medicine, equal parts superstition and survival. They were not scholars, but craftsmen of pain, shaping the body with blades in the name of healing. The Great Plague arrives when the Black Death swept into Europe in the mid-14th century. It struck like a storm with no warning. It arrived via trade ships, creeping through ports like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. The disease, a combination of bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague, spread faster than medieval medicine could comprehend. Physicians, accustomed to diagnosing through humors and astrology, suddenly faced death on a scale they'd never imagined. Within months, entire towns were depopulated. Streets were silent except for the wheels of death carts. Medical theory had no defense. Scholars debated whether miasma, poisonous air, was to blame, or whether the stars had aligned in a deadly conjunction. Some blamed earthquakes releasing deadly vapors, while others pointed to divine punishment for human sins. None of these explanations produced effective cures, but they shaped the desperate measures communities took: burning aromatic herbs, banning certain foods, holding massive processions, and fleeing to the countryside. Doctors, often powerless, relied on their old tools: bloodletting, purging, and prayer. Some prescribed living in darkness to cool the humors, while others advised avoiding bathing altogether, fearing that open pores would let the plague in. Ironically, such advice often made people sicker. Many physicians died themselves, either from exposure to infected patients or from their ineffective treatments. What made the plague especially terrifying was its speed and randomness. A healthy merchant could cough in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Families barricaded themselves indoors, leaving loved ones to die alone. Graveyards overflowed, and mass pits became the new normal. In many cities, normal medical and religious structures collapsed entirely, leaving people to rely on wandering healers, charlatans, or sheer luck. The arrival of the plague exposed medieval medicine's deepest weaknesses. For all its rituals, theories, and prayers, it stood helpless against a microscopic enemy no one could see, but everyone could smell, fear, and bury. Buboes, boils, and bleeding, Black Death treatments, as the Black Death raged on. Physicians and healers scrambled to treat its terrifying symptoms: buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits and neck, along with fevers, delirium, and hemorrhages. These buboes could grow to the size of apples, blacken, and burst with pus. To a medieval healer, this was tangible evidence of corruption in the body, something that had to be released. The most common treatment was lancing the buboes. Surgeons would cut them open with knives, razors, or heated irons to let the poison drain. The procedure was excruciating, often performed on delirious patients restrained by family members. Afterward, the wounds were smeared with mixtures of vinegar, ashes, or herbal pastes meant to draw out the plague. Unfortunately, these open sores often became infected, accelerating death rather than preventing it. Another favorite approach was bloodletting near the buboes. Physicians believed redirecting the body's fluids could drain the venom. They would bleed. Patients from the opposite side of the body from where the buboes formed, following astrological guidance to pick the right vein. Of course, this weakened already dying patients further. Some were bled daily until they collapsed. Herbal remedies ranged from somewhat helpful, like using rose oil to cool fevers, to bizarre. One popular prescription involved applying a paste of crushed emeralds to the buboes for those who could afford it. Others wrapped patients in vinegar-soaked rags or burned sulfur under their beds. Folk healers sometimes relied on charms, amulets, and whispered incantations, blending superstition with desperation. These treatments rarely worked. Mortality rates remained staggering, but the persistence of these practices shows just how deeply entrenched humoral and magical thinking was. Even when faced with a disease that defied explanation, medieval medicine doubled down on its old painful methods. Flagellants. Whipping away the plague as death mounted and faith in physicians crumbled, some Europeans turned inward, or rather against themselves. The flagellants were religious zealots who believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. To atone, they marched through towns in organized processions, whipping their bare backs until the flesh split and blood sprayed onto cobblestones. The sound of chains, chanting, and self-inflicted lashes echoed through city streets. These processions were meant to appease divine wrath, not heal the sick. But in practice, they spread panic and sometimes the disease itself. Flagellants moved from town to town, carrying infected fleas on their clothes. Authorities initially welcomed them, seeing their devotion as holy. But soon, church leaders grew uneasy. The flagellants began claiming they didn't need priests, that their suffering alone could save the world. Pope Clement VI eventually condemned the movement, fearing both heresy and unrest. From a medical perspective, flagellation represented a complete abandonment of science, even by medieval standards. Instead of treating symptoms, people treated their souls through blood and pain. Some believed that each lash drew out sin the way lancing a bubo drew out plague. Crowds gathered to watch, weeping or joining in, as if communal suffering could somehow drive the pestilence away. For the participants, this was real medicine, spiritual surgery. Their wounds became badges of penitence, their blood offerings to a furious God. It's easy to dismiss them as fanatics, but in a world where physicians failed and corpses filled every street, self-flagellation offered something medicine couldn't, a sense of control. The flagellant movement shows how medieval responses to disease could swing from clinical brutality to religious frenzy, often coexisting in the same town, even the same family. Quarantine and isolation, medieval style. One of the few measures that had any real effect during plagues was quarantine, though it emerged more through observation than medical theory. Cities like Venice pioneered the practice. Ships arriving from infected ports were held offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, giving us the word quarantine before passengers could disembark. Authorities noticed that people isolated for long periods were less likely to spread disease, even if they didn't understand why. On land, quarantine took harsh forms. Whole neighborhoods were barricaded, with guards stationed at gates to keep residents in or out. Affected homes were marked with painted crosses and sometimes sealed shut, effectively condemning everyone inside. Food was delivered through windows or left outside doors. If someone tried to escape, he could be executed, all in the name of health. Temporary pest houses sprang up on the edges of towns, where the sick were sent to die away from the population. These were often little more than shacks or abandoned barns, with minimal medical care. Inside cities, isolation could be brutal. People were locked in their homes with dying relatives, forbidden to leave until the entire household was dead or recovered. Priests and physicians entered at great personal risk, if at all. Merchants and travelers often bore the brunt of suspicion. Road checkpoints were established. Letters were fumigated or sprinkled with vinegar before being opened. Quarantine became as much about social control as disease control, keeping order in cities teetering on the edge of chaos. Though crude and often cruel, quarantine worked better than bleeding or flagellation. It was one of the few medieval treatments that genuinely slowed the spread of disease, even if its success was more accidental than intentional. Pest houses and death carts. In plague-stricken cities, pest houses became the grim way stations between home and grave. These makeshift hospitals were often established in abandoned monasteries, barns, or tents outside city walls. Their primary function wasn't to heal, it was to remove the sick from the healthy, keeping cities functioning while the infected awaited either death or miraculous recovery. Conditions inside were nightmarish. Overcrowding was rampant, with patients lying on straw mats, soaked in sweat, vomit, and blood. There were no real treatments, only prayers, and the occasional application of vinegar or herbs. Staff were poorly trained, if they existed at all. Many pest houses were manned by criminals or desperate peasants hired to tend to the sick for a wage, and often dying themselves soon after. Death carts patrolled the streets, driven by men ringing bells or shouting, "Bring out your dead." Corpses were collected daily, piled high, and hauled to mass graves outside the city. Sometimes the living were mistaken for dead and thrown onto carts, their cries muffled under heaps of bodies. For many, this was the final stop. Pest house, death cart, pit. Pest houses reflected a grim shift in medieval medicine. When treatments failed, containment and disposal became the priority. Cities couldn't afford to have plague victims lingering at home. This mechanized approach to death, moving the sick and dead like refuse, became a defining image of the Black Death era. To modern ears, this sounds cold and inhumane, but for medieval towns struggling to survive, it was a harsh necessity. The pest house was where medicine gave way to logistics, a chilling precursor to later institutions. Burning herbs, burning bodies. Before the discovery of germs, smell was medicine's main clue to disease. Plague carried a foul stench, so physicians assumed the air itself was corrupted. In response, they burned everything from fragrant herbs to entire buildings. Streets were filled with the smoke of juniper, rosemary, pine, and sulfur. People carried pomanders, perforated balls filled with spices to clean the air around them. Authorities sometimes lit massive bonfires in city centers, believing that the heat and smoke would drive away miasma. Infected bedding, clothes, and even furniture were thrown into flames. In some places, entire houses where plague victims died were burned to the ground, their ashes scattered as purification. The smell of burning mixed with the natural stench of death to create an atmosphere both horrifying and strangely ritualistic. But burning didn't stop at objects. In some cases, bodies themselves were burned, either because burial grounds overflowed or to prevent contagion. While cremation wasn't the norm in medieval Christianity, emergencies overrode doctrine. Mass pyres were sometimes lit on city outskirts, sending columns of smoke skyward like grim beacons. This reliance on fire shows how medieval people saw disease as something external and tangible, a foulness that could be smoked out like rats. Burning herbs gave comfort, and occasionally some antiseptic effect, but mostly it was psychological. It gave people the illusion of cleansing in a time when invisible microbes ruled unchecked. Plague doctor's costume and the power of fear. One of the most enduring images of medieval medicine is the plague doctor's costume, the long waxed coat, wide-brimmed hat, and most famously, the bird-like beak mask. Contrary to popular belief, this outfit wasn't widespread in the earliest Black Death outbreaks. It emerged more prominently in later plague waves of the 17th century, but its roots were medieval, born from the miasma theory. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth meant to filter out poisoned air. The coat was coated with wax to repel bodily fluids, and the cane allowed the doctor to prod patients without touching them. To medieval eyes, this outfit was both practical and terrifying, a harbinger of death entering their homes. Plague doctors occupied a strange space between healer and undertaker. Many were hired by towns rather than individual patients, tasked with recording deaths, diagnosing cases, and occasionally performing treatments. Some were skilled physicians. Others were opportunists with little medical knowledge but a high tolerance for danger. Their very presence inspired fear. Children hid at the sight of the beaked mask. Families whispered prayers when one appeared at their door. In many ways, the costume's psychological impact was as significant as its protective function. It marked the boundary between the living and the dying. The plague doctor's garb remains one of the most haunting legacies of medieval medicine, a symbol of how fear, fashion, and flawed theory combined into something unforgettable. Midwives and herbalists under suspicion? In medieval villages, the local midwife or herbalist was often more trusted than any distant physician. She knew every family, every birth, and every ailment that swept through the community. Her knowledge was practical, passed down through mothers and grandmothers, and it came from years of hands-on experience with plants, wounds, and people, not from dusty Latin manuscripts. For centuries, this female medical network thrived quietly, existing parallel to clerical medicine. But as the church expanded its control, this organic medical culture became dangerous. Healing without church sanction was increasingly framed as dabbling in the occult. A woman who cured a fever with herbs might be praised one day and condemned the next if the cure failed or aroused suspicion. The same hands that delivered babies could later be accused of summoning evil spirits. These healers occupied a paradoxical role, revered when their remedies worked, feared when they didn't. Midwives were often the only people willing to take risks during difficult births or deadly fevers. Yet, their successes were sometimes attributed to the devil. Their failures, inevitable in a world without modern medicine. It became proof of evil rather than human limitation. Over time, their skills, which should have been celebrated, were twisted into signs of witchcraft. The church and emerging male medical authorities found this female knowledge threatening. It represented autonomy, independence, and a challenge to their monopoly over the body and soul. These women weren't just healing, they were preserving pre-Christian traditions, local wisdom, and community trust. It made them powerful. And in medieval society, power outside official hierarchies was dangerous. As suspicion hardened into policy, midwives and herbalists found themselves increasingly surveilled. Rumors could spread like wildfire, and once branded with even a whisper of witchcraft, a woman's reputation could never be fully restored. This shift set the stage for centuries of witch persecutions, in which women who once held the community together were systematically dismantled and demonized. Witchcraft is medical competition. Beneath the religious language, witchcraft accusations were also about competition. Male physicians, often university-trained and operating within guilds, saw female healers as rivals. Herbalists offered cheaper, more effective remedies to the poor, cutting into the economic base of official medicine. Midwives controlled fertility knowledge, something male doctors neither understood nor could profit from directly. The quickest way to remove competition was to label it heresy. As universities rose in prestige, they framed their Latin-based Galenic training as rational, while dismissing female knowledge as superstitious. This wasn't about who healed better. It was about who controlled medical authority. Physicians couldn't replicate the intimate village relationships that women had built over generations, so they turned to theological weaponry. Accusing a healer of witchcraft instantly delegitimized her, no matter how many lives she had saved. The Malleus Maleficarum and similar manuals codified this shift, depicting midwives as demonic collaborators who caused miscarriages, harmed infants, and consorted with evil spirits. This wasn't just paranoia, it was propaganda. These texts circulated widely, giving inquisitors and local authorities ready-made proof for any accusation. A woman who knew too much about herbs or anatomy could be branded a witch almost overnight. Communities were often torn apart by these accusations. Neighbors who had relied on a healer for decades suddenly turned on her to save themselves. The church's framing of disease as both spiritual and physical allowed suspicion to spread in all directions. If medicine failed, it wasn't because the world lacked understanding, it was because evil was supposedly afoot. By redefining female healers as witches, male institutions seized both authority and income. What had once been a pluralistic, community-based medical system narrowed into a rigid, male-dominated hierarchy. The stakes weren't just medical, they were social, spiritual, and political. The church versus folk healers. Folk medicine represented centuries of pre-Christian knowledge. It relied on seasonal cycles, lunar calendars, and herbal traditions deeply rooted in the land. The church saw this as both a challenge and a threat. Healing was supposed to flow through God, saints, or clergy, not through local women boiling leaves in kitchens. By condemning these practices as pagan or superstitious, the Church could both discredit and replace them. Edicts and synods targeted folk healers systematically. Bishops instructed clergy to warn parishioners against heathen remedies, while inquisitors interrogated patients about where they had sought treatment. Healing rituals were reframed as sin, confession replaced herbal poultices, and prayers to saints were promoted as the only legitimate medicine. The effect was a slow, grinding erosion of folk medical authority. Yet folk healers persisted, especially in remote rural regions. People still turned to the village midwife for fevers or wounds because she was effective and accessible. The Church couldn't fully eradicate these practices, so it sought to regulate and surveil them instead. This uneasy coexistence meant that at any moment, a healer could be celebrated for saving lives or condemned for witchcraft. This dynamic created intense paranoia. If someone recovered after seeing a folk healer, it might be declared proof of demonic assistance. If they died, the healer might be accused of causing their death. Either outcome could end badly for the woman involved. In many cases, healers survived not through acceptance, but through silence and discretion, practicing in the shadows. The Church's aggressive stance fractured communities and redefined healing as a moral battleground. Instead of being judged by results, healers were judged by who sanctioned their work. Authority mattered more than effectiveness. Childbirth in the Middle Ages, a dangerous ordeal. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. Without anesthesia, sterile instruments, or understanding of infection, mothers often faced days of agony with little guarantee of survival. Midwives were the unsung heroes of this process, guiding women through pain and uncertainty using herbal compresses, whispered prayers, and hard-won practical knowledge. Their role was indispensable, but also precarious. Labor could go wrong in countless ways. Breech births, hemorrhages, or infections could kill mother and child within hours. When tragedy struck, blame fell easily on the midwife. A stillbirth wasn't just a personal loss, it could be seen as a spiritual failing, or even proof of witchcraft. Communities desperate for explanations often found convenient scapegoats in the very women who had risked everything to help. The Church inserted itself into childbirth through ritual rather than medicine. Priests insisted on baptisms during labor and confessions in case of death, but offered no practical aid. Midwives were sometimes forced to work under clerical supervision, a bizarre spectacle where prayers replaced tools. Their expertise was tolerated only as long as it didn't overshadow church authority. Despite these pressures, midwives developed remarkable techniques. They recognized signs of dangerous labor, used oils to ease delivery, and employed makeshift tools to reposition infants. Their methods weren't always successful, but they represented the best hope available. This made them both respected and feared. Respected when things went right, feared when they didn't. Over time, childbirth became another front in the war between folk medicine and institutional control. Midwives' skills remained vital, but their status grew increasingly fragile. A single complicated birth could turn a respected healer into a condemned witch. Herbal potions and abortifacients. Medieval women had long relied on herbal knowledge to manage fertility. Plants like pennyroyal, savin, rue, and juniper were known to stimulate menstruation or induce abortion. These weren't mystical practices, they were practical, often born of necessity in societies where pregnancies were frequent and dangerous. Such knowledge gave women limited but real control over their bodies, a control the Church found intolerable. Theological authorities equated abortifacients with murder, condemning both their use and those who provided them. Yet despite these prohibitions, women continued to share and use these remedies in secret. Some were mild and unreliable, others dangerously potent. Misjudging a dose could lead to poisoning, organ damage, or death. For many women, the risk was worth it. Healers who specialized in these remedies were particularly vulnerable to witchcraft accusations. Miscarriage following treatment could be twisted into proof of evil intent. Even carrying certain herbs could be construed as evidence. This secrecy turned what had once been open, shared knowledge into something hidden, whispered, and perilous. Male physicians largely ignored or condemned abortifacient knowledge, labeling it women's lore rather than scientific medicine. yet they had no safer alternatives to offer. In this vacuum, midwives remained indispensable for those seeking control over their reproductive lives. That independence made them dangerous in the eyes of institutions built on obedience. By criminalizing this knowledge, medieval authorities ensured that reproductive health remained shrouded in fear. It wasn't just about abortion, it was about silencing women's authority over their own bodies. Accusations, trials, and tortures of healers as the medieval witch hunts gained momentum. Healers, especially midwives and herbalists, became prime targets for accusation. What began as whispers of strange herbs or unusual practices could quickly spiral into formal charges of witchcraft. Communities under the strain of disease, crop failure, or unexplained deaths were eager to find scapegoats. And women who held medical knowledge outside church control were convenient candidates. The trials that followed were often less about evidence and more about reinforcing power structures. Accusations frequently started with something small, a failed cure, a sudden illness, or even a personal feud. Neighbors testified against neighbors, often under pressure or out of fear of becoming the next accused. Medical tools like birthing stools, herb satchels, or ointments were displayed in court as witchcraft implements. The church's framing of disease as a battle between God and the devil made it easy to cast healers as agents of evil when cures failed. Once accused, the process turned brutal. Inquisitors and local magistrates relied heavily on confessions, which were frequently extracted through torture. Women were stretched on racks, dunked in water, or subjected to sleeplessness until they confessed to impossible crimes, consorting with demons, killing infants, or flying through the night. These confessions were then recorded and used to justify further arrests, creating a cycle of fear and persecution. The irony is that many of the crimes listed were simply descriptions of medical practice. Using belladonna to ease pain, burning herbs to disinfect, or chanting prayers during childbirth could all be twisted into evidence of demonic activity. What had once been ordinary healing became criminalized through the lens of paranoia. The result was not just individual suffering, but the systematic dismantling of centuries of folk medical knowledge. Public executions often followed, serving as grim spectacles meant to terrify the populace into obedience. Burning or hanging an accused healer wasn't just punishment, it was a warning. It told women that healing outside sanctioned boundaries was a death sentence. It told communities that their trust should be placed in the church and male physicians, not their neighbors. This climate of fear effectively severed the chain of female medical knowledge. Mothers no longer passed remedies to daughters as openly, and many herbs and techniques were lost for generations. The persecution of healers was not just a tragedy of individuals, it was a silencing of an entire parallel medical tradition. Female anatomy, according to medieval texts. Medieval medical texts portrayed female anatomy through a lens of superstition, classical error, and moral judgment. Influenced by Galenic theory, many believed that women were simply inverted men, that female genitalia were male organs turned inward due to a lack of heat. This bizarre idea shaped how doctors interpreted childbirth, menstruation, and even disease. Anatomy wasn't seen objectively, it was filtered through cultural prejudice. Texts written by male clerics often contained glaring inaccuracies. Female reproductive organs were described in vague, poetic, or even fearful terms. Wombs were sometimes depicted as roaming around the body, causing hysteria when they moved. Menstruation was interpreted as the body's way of purging excess humors, not a reproductive process. These ideas weren't fringe, they dominated medical education for centuries. Because dissection of women was rare and heavily restricted, male scholars relied on animal anatomy, hearsay, and imagination. The result was a pseudo-scientific mythology rather than accurate knowledge. Female sexuality was especially misunderstood. Sexual pleasure was either ignored or treated as dangerous, and female desire was often pathologized as evidence of sin or demonic influence. These misconceptions had direct medical consequences. Treatments for wandering wombs included fumigation of the lower body or applying sweet-smelling substances near the genitals to lure the womb back to place. Hysteria was treated with purges, bloodletting, or prayer. Menstrual irregularities were blamed on moral failings, witchcraft, or possession. In this environment, real gynecological issues were often dismissed or worsened by ineffective remedies. Women themselves were excluded from the production of these texts, meaning their perspectives were systematically erased. Their lived experiences of childbirth, menstruation, and sexual health were replaced by abstract theories crafted by men who had never examined a female body. These texts didn't just misinform physicians, they shaped cultural attitudes toward women's bodies for generations. This distorted understanding of female anatomy reinforced a cycle of ignorance and control. Women were simultaneously mystified and medicalized, treated as both dangerous and fragile. It laid the groundwork for centuries of misogynistic medical practice, much of which persisted well beyond the medieval period. Medieval hospitals, places to die. The word hospital conjures images of care, but in the medieval world, hospitals were often closer to hospices, or even warehouses for the sick. These institutions were usually run by religious orders, and their primary function wasn't to heal, but to offer spiritual preparation for death. Patients lay in crowded halls, surrounded by the groans of the dying and the stench of untreated wounds. Medical treatment was minimal. Prayer was the main prescription. Hospitals prioritized salvation over recovery. Patients were encouraged to confess their sins and receive last rites. Priests walked between rows of beds far more often than physicians did. Food was basic, sanitation was non-existent, and infections spread like wildfire in these enclosed spaces. If one person arrived with a contagious disease, the entire ward was quickly at risk. Nursing was considered a religious duty, not a medical profession. Many caregivers were untrained nuns who did their best with limited knowledge. Herbal remedies were administered sporadically, but there was little understanding of hygiene or contagion. Instruments were reused without cleaning, wounds were left open, and lice, fleas, and rats were constant companions to the sick. For the poor, hospitals were often their only refuge, but they entered with the knowledge that they might never leave. Wealthier patients often received treatment at home, avoiding the grim conditions of communal wards. Hospitals were also used to isolate lepers, plague victims, and the mentally ill, grouping vastly different patients together under one roof. Rather than places of healing, medieval hospitals were spaces where the physical and spiritual worlds collided. Their primary aim was to guide souls to heaven, not to restore health. In many cases, entering a hospital was a death sentence. The Lazar houses. Leprosy and social exile. Leprosy was one of the most feared diseases of the medieval period, not only because of its disfiguring symptoms, but because of the intense social stigma attached to it. Those diagnosed with leprosy were often declared legally dead, banished from society, stripped of property, and forced to live in isolated leper colonies known as Lazar houses. These institutions were less about treatment and more about containment. The Church interpreted leprosy as both a punishment from God and a spiritual blessing, framing sufferers as living martyrs. Lepers were sometimes forced to participate in public funeral ceremonies for themselves, symbolizing their separation from the living. Once inside a Lazar house, escape was nearly impossible, and contact with outsiders was strictly controlled. Medical care in these colonies was minimal. Lepers were given simple herbal balms, prayers, and occasionally dietary advice, but no real treatments existed. Instead, the emphasis was on moral discipline and religious devotion. Residents were expected to pray for the souls of others, effectively becoming a spiritual labor force for society. Despite the isolation, Lazar houses were surprisingly numerous, dotting the European landscape. Some were well-funded by wealthy patrons, offering relatively comfortable accommodations. Others were filthy and neglected. In all cases, they reinforced the idea that disease was as much a social and moral problem as it was a physical one. The leper's bell worn, or rung to announce their presence, became a haunting symbol of medieval public health. It was less about warning of contagion and more about maintaining strict social boundaries between the pure and the unclean. Insane asylums, early mental health treatments. Mental illness in the medieval world was poorly understood, and those who exhibited unusual behavior were often feared rather than treated with compassion. Early insane asylums were less therapeutic institutions and more prisons cloaked in religious authority. Many of these facilities were run by monastic orders or municipal authorities, and their primary function was to contain the mad, not heal them. The conditions were brutal, with inmates chained to walls, kept in darkness, or left to wander in filthy courtyards. The prevailing belief was that mental illness stemmed from demonic possession, imbalance of humors, or divine punishment. Treatments were based on these assumptions. Some patients were bled in an attempt to balance their humors. Others were subjected to cold baths, shock, or whipping to drive out evil spirits. Some asylums, loud music, bells, or chanting were used as crude forms of sensory overload, under the notion that startling the patient might restore sanity. Famous institutions like Bethlehem Hospital in London, known later as Bedlam, became infamous for their cruelty. Visitors from the public were sometimes allowed to pay a fee to watch the inmates, turning mental illness into a grotesque spectacle. The cries, moans, and violent outbursts of patients were treated as entertainment for curious onlookers. This dehumanizing environment reinforced the stigma around mental illness, making recovery almost impossible. Inside the asylums, there was little separation between the violent and the vulnerable. People with epilepsy, trauma, melancholia, or intellectual disabilities were all thrown together. The lack of medical understanding meant treatments often made conditions worse. Restraints, isolation, and malnutrition were common. Religious rituals, including confession and exorcism, were frequently forced upon patients regardless of their actual conditions. Many inmates lived their entire lives within these walls, forgotten by their families and society. Their suffering was justified through religious rhetoric. Enduring madness was seen as part of God's will, and the role of the asylum was simply to manage their bodies until death. These institutions reveal the stark reality of medieval mental health care, not healing but containment through cruelty. Exorcisms for epilepsy and madness. When medicine failed to explain seizures or erratic behavior, medieval society turned to the church. Epilepsy, in particular, was often interpreted as a sign of possession or divine punishment. Rather than treating the brain, priests sought to treat the soul. Exorcisms became a primary medical intervention for conditions that were poorly understood. Patients were brought before clergy, restrained, and subjected to intense rituals designed to expel demons. Exorcism ceremonies were dramatic. Priests recited Latin prayers, brandished crosses, sprinkled holy water, and commanded invisible forces to depart. Some sufferers were forced to swallow consecrated bread or wear amulets inscribed with biblical verses. They convulsed or screamed during the ritual, which was common for anyone experiencing seizures or trauma. It was taken as evidence that the demon was resisting. These reactions often reinforced belief in possession, ensuring the cycle continued. For many, these rituals were terrifying. Epileptic seizures were misunderstood as the body literally struggling with an internal spirit, and the violent exorcisms that followed sometimes caused injuries or death. People experiencing mental health crises, depression, or psychosis were similarly treated with spiritual warfare instead of medical care. The church maintained authority by claiming only divine power could heal such ailments. Sometimes, exorcisms were combined with medical techniques, such as bloodletting or purgatives, to weaken the demon before the priest intervened. Herbal fumigations were occasionally used, not for their medicinal properties, but to drive out evil through smoke. Patients endured these rituals repeatedly, often without improvement, but their suffering served as public proof of the church's power over unseen forces. Exorcism blurred the line between medical treatment and religious theater. It provided communities with an explanation for frightening conditions, but it did nothing to address the actual causes. For those afflicted, it often meant years of spiritual scrutiny, physical harm, and social isolation. Pilgrimage as prescription when local treatments failed. One of the most common remedies prescribed was not a medicine but a journey. Pilgrimages to holy sites were believed to bring divine healing, especially for chronic illnesses, blindness, paralysis, or mental disorders. Physicians, confessors, or family members might recommend a pilgrimage to show devotion and seek miraculous intervention. This transformed healing into a spiritual quest. Popular destinations included Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome, each associated with saints known for their healing miracles. Patients and their families undertook long, arduous journeys across dangerous terrain, often while still sick. Pilgrims slept in crowded inns, begged for food, and exposed themselves to new diseases along the way. For the wealthy, the journey could be more comfortable, but even nobles faced the risk of bandits and harsh travel conditions. At the shrines, Pilgrims participated in rituals such as bathing in sacred springs, touching relics, or receiving blessings from priests. Some drank miracle waters, while others left offerings or performed acts of penance like walking barefoot or carrying heavy crosses. Healing was often attributed to faith and the intercession of saints rather than any physical intervention. Pilgrimages also had an economic dimension. Towns with famous shrines profited enormously from the influx of sick travelers, merchants, and the church itself benefited financially, making pilgrimage a thriving industry. Relics and holy tokens were sold as souvenirs or protective charms, blurring commerce and faith. While a small number of people likely experienced genuine psychosomatic relief or natural recoveries during these journeys, most returned unchanged or worse off. Yet the tradition persisted for centuries, because it offered hope in a world where medicine often had no real answers. Surgical instruments of horror. Medieval surgery was a grim affair, and the instruments used were as brutal as the procedures themselves. Anesthesia didn't exist, and antiseptics were centuries away. Surgeons relied on a collection of sharp, crude tools designed to cut, scrape, cauterize, and crush. The sight of these instruments alone was enough to terrify patients, who often had to be restrained by multiple men during procedures. Common instruments included bone saws, trepanation drills, flesh hooks, and long cautery irons heated until glowing red. Surgeons also used forceps, scalpels, and amputation knives with wide, heavy blades for swift cuts. Leech jars, cupping vessels, and scarification tools rounded out the toolkit. Most instruments were made of iron or bronze, which rusted easily and were rarely cleaned between uses, spreading infection rapidly. Because surgery was considered a manual trade rather than an intellectual one, it was often performed by barber surgeons or battlefield medics rather than university-trained physicians. Their priority was speed and survival. Amputations, for instance, had to be completed in under 2 minutes to prevent the patient from dying of shock. After cutting, wounds were often cauterized with hot irons to stop bleeding, an excruciating solution that sometimes killed patients outright. Complex surgeries like trepanation, drilling into the skull to relieve pressure, were done with hand-cranked drills, with the patient fully conscious. Eye surgeries for cataracts involved inserting needles into the eye to push the lens down, a procedure called couching that often resulted in blindness. Surgeons worked in bloody clothes, reused bandages, lacked any understanding of bacteria, making postoperative infections nearly inevitable. Yet, despite the horror, these instruments represented a strange kind of progress. They showed a willingness to act upon the body, to intervene physically in ways earlier healers had avoided. But without anesthesia or sanitation, these interventions were closer to torture than modern medicine. University medicine. Learning by dissection. On the living. By the later Middle Ages, medical universities were rising in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Montpellier. These institutions were meant to elevate medicine from a trade to a learned profession. But the way they studied the human body was often shocking by modern standards. Dissection was rare, tightly regulated by the church, and usually performed on executed criminals. However, in some cases, students observed procedures on living patients, particularly those from poor or marginalized groups. Public dissections were theatrical events. Professors sat on raised chairs reading from classical texts like Galen, while a barber or surgeon did the cutting below. Students watched silently as the professor compared the real body to ancient writings, often correcting the corpse to fit the text rather than questioning the text itself. This reverence for ancient authority stifled innovation and sometimes led to absurd contradictions. When living subjects were involved, it was usually under the guise of treatment. For example, opening abscesses, removing bladder stones, or trepanning the skull. Poor patients, prisoners, or the mentally ill had little choice. They became living anatomy lessons, enduring unimaginable pain for the sake of education. Surgeons justified this by claiming it served the greater good of knowledge. Dissections and surgical demonstrations were conducted in cold, unsanitary lecture halls. The stench of decay mingled with the sound of recitations in Latin. Students were trained to see bodies as objects, not people, and this detachment shaped the clinical culture of future physicians. Compassion was secondary to curiosity. University medicine did mark a turning point. It institutionalized medical learning. But it also normalized cruelty in the name of science, laying early foundations for experimental practices that blurred the line between research and torture. In these lecture halls, the future of medicine was being forged, but at a terrible human cost. Urine analysis and medieval diagnosis. In medieval Europe, urine was treated like a crystal ball, a window into the inner workings of the human body. Physicians and barber surgeons routinely examined a patient's urine as their primary diagnostic tool. A physician's authority was often measured by his ability to interpret the color, consistency, smell, and even taste of urine. Detailed urine charts were printed and circulated, showing dozens of shades from pale straw to deep crimson, each associated with a different illness. Physicians collected urine in glass flasks called machillae, holding them up to the light like fine wine tasters. They studied whether the fluid was cloudy or clear, whether it contained sediments or bubbles, and how it settled over time. Each trait was thought to correspond to an imbalance in the four humors, or to a specific organ malfunction. For example, dark urine might signal overheating of the liver, while pale, watery urine suggested coldness and phlegmatic excess. Patients would often send their urine to physicians by courier, sometimes miles away, along with written descriptions of their symptoms. This urine consultation allowed doctors to diagnose without ever meeting the patient. Unsurprisingly, this method led to many misdiagnoses. But it also reinforced the physician's role as a learned interpreter of hidden bodily signs. The reliance on urine was partly due to religious restrictions on touching the body, and partly due to limited anatomical knowledge. Dissection was rare, so physicians turned to fluids instead. In some cases, urine analysis was combined with astrological charts to pinpoint when the disease began and how it would progress. While this practice seems absurd today, it reveals how medieval medicine prioritized observation and symbolic interpretation over direct intervention. In a world with few effective treatments, urine was a tangible clue, and physicians built entire careers on reading it like scripture. Tasting blood, smelling disease just as urine was analyzed with meticulous attention, blood and odors were believed to reveal disease. Some medieval practitioners literally tasted blood to determine its properties. A sweet taste might indicate one humor, a bitter or salty taste another. Though dangerous, this was seen as an essential diagnostic skill. Physicians also smelled wounds, breath, sweat, and excretions, believing that each illness had its own unique stench. The idea stemmed from the belief that disease corrupted the natural balance of the body, producing foul vapors or altering vital fluids. The smell of gangrene, rotting flesh, or infected wounds was indeed distinct, but medieval physicians interpreted these odors not as signs of bacteria, but as manifestations of internal imbalance or demonic corruption. In plague times, entire towns were thought to reek of death, and physicians used this sensory information to decide on treatments. If someone's breath was cold and sweet, it might be considered a phlegmatic imbalance. If it was hot and acrid, it indicated choleric overheating. Practitioners believed they could detect fevers, infections, or blocked humors simply by leaning close to a patient's mouth or skin. This sensory approach extended to the smell of urine, feces, and vomit. Physicians were trained to identify dozens of disease smells, turning the human body into a kind of living laboratory. Of course, these methods were often inconsistent and subjective, but they gave physicians a way to assert expertise in a world without microscopes or lab tests. Ironically, these crude methods sometimes produced accidental truths. Recognizing the smell of infected wounds or noticing unusual breath odors did give early clues about disease. Unfortunately, their explanations were rooted in superstition, so treatments rarely followed logically. Zodiac Man. When to bleed according to the stars. Few images capture medieval medical thought better than the Zodiac Man. A diagram of the human body overlaid with the 12 signs of the zodiac. Physicians believed that each part of the body was governed by a particular constellation, and that medical treatments, especially bloodletting, had to be timed according to celestial movements. For example, Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, Leo the heart, Libra the kidneys, and so on.
Ow.
Before performing surgery, setting bones, or even administering herbs, doctors consulted astrological tables to see where the moon and planets were positioned. If the stars were unfavorable, procedures were delayed, sometimes for weeks. Bloodletting was most influenced by astrology. Physicians believed that bleeding a patient when the moon was passing through the zodiac sign, governing the diseased body part, could be fatal. Calendars were printed with complex charts showing lucky and unlucky days for each body part. Monasteries and universities alike taught this method as legitimate science. Astrology also guided diagnosis. A patient's birth chart was examined to determine their natural temperament: choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic, or melancholic, and predict which diseases they might suffer. The position of planets during the onset of illness was analyzed to forecast the disease's course and outcome. This celestial medicine blended pagan star lore with Christian theology, resulting in a hybrid system that dominated medical thinking for centuries. Even elite physicians like those serving kings used astrological timing to decide when to operate, showing just how deeply the cosmos shaped earthly bodies in medieval thought. Animal parts and alchemy. One of the strangest aspects of medieval medicine was its willingness to use animal parts in remedies. Physicians and apothecaries blended practical herbalism with alchemy and sympathetic magic, believing that the properties of animals could be transferred to humans through ingestion or application. For example, powdered unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk, was sold as a universal antidote to poison. Air fat was rubbed on the chest to give strength. Dried snake flesh was powdered to treat skin diseases. Ground animal bones, blood, or organs were mixed with herbs to create potions. In some cases, live animals were even applied directly to wounds. For gout, a live rooster's backside was held against the patient's foot to draw out the pain. Alchemy added another layer. Practitioners sought to distill the essence of animals through boiling, burning, and refining, creating elixirs that supposedly captured their healing spirit. Toads, bats, and scorpions were common ingredients in alchemical recipes. Physicians believed that ingesting these substances balanced humors or countered specific ailments through sympathetic properties. Some remedies were shockingly elaborate. Treatment for rabies involved cutting open a dog's head, removing a piece of its brain, drying it, and feeding it to the patient, a grim example of magical thinking masquerading as science. These practices reflected a world where symbolism and physical medicine overlapped completely. Animals weren't just ingredients, they were seen as carriers of cosmic forces. By consuming or wearing parts of them, medieval people believed they could harness nature's hidden powers. Miasma theory, blaming the air. Before germs, bad air was the enemy. Miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by noxious vapors, dominated medieval and Renaissance thought. Plague, fevers, and other illnesses were believed to arise from rotting matter, stagnant water, or swampy ground, which released invisible poisonous clouds. These vapors entered the body through breathing and corrupted the humors. Cities responded with public health measures rooted in this theory. They burned incense, scattered herbs like rosemary and lavender, and carried posies to purify the air. Physicians wore beaked plague masks stuffed with aromatic substances to filter out deadly miasmas. Streets were sometimes cleared of waste, not to stop germs, but to eliminate the stench thought to cause disease. Individuals protected themselves by closing windows at night, burning juniper indoors, or wearing perfume-soaked clothing. In some towns, cannons were fired into the air to disperse the bad vapors, and bells were rung to create wind currents. Wealthier families fled cities entirely during outbreaks, retreating to the countryside where the air was believed to be purer. Though incorrect, miasma theory occasionally produced positive side effects like improved sanitation and better airflow. Clearing garbage did reduce disease spread, even if people misunderstood why. But it also led to harmful practices, such as blaming foul-smelling communities, like tanners or the poor, for outbreaks, deepening social divides. For centuries, the fight against invisible miasmas shaped everything from urban planning to personal hygiene. It was one of the longest-lasting medical theories in history, persisting well into the 19th century before germ theory finally displaced it. Humoral diets. Food as cure and punishment. Food was more than nourishment in medieval medicine. It was a tool to manipulate the body's humors. Physicians prescribed strict dietary regimens to rebalance a patient's internal state. Each food was classified as hot, cold, moist, or dry, and assigned to one of the four humors. Eating the wrong foods could cause disease. Eating the right ones could supposedly cure it. For example, someone with too much blood, a sanguine excess, might be instructed to avoid red meat and wine and eat cooling, moist foods like cucumbers and barley water. A melancholic patient might be given warming spices and roasted meats to counteract their cold and dry temperament. These diets were often extreme, bordering on punishment, especially during chronic illnesses. Fasting was also common. It wasn't just religious, it was medical. Starving the body was thought to reset the humors, similar to bleeding or purging. Some treatments involved alternating between heavy feasts and days of near-total abstinence to shock the body back into balance. Dietary advice extended to the timing of meals, which was often linked to astrology. Physicians advised eating or avoiding certain foods depending on the position of the moon or the patient's zodiac sign. Rich families employed personal physicians to manage their diets, turning mealtime into a medical ritual. Although flawed, humoral diets represented one of the few areas where medieval medicine genuinely influenced everyday life. Every household, from peasants to kings, was shaped by these ideas. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was medicine, discipline, and destiny on a plate. Boiling oils and iron hooks, battlefield surgery on the medieval battlefield. Wounds were not just a matter of survival, they were often a death sentence wrapped in a ritual of agony. When knights clashed with swords, maces, and arrows, the aftermath was a human butcher's yard. Field surgeons followed armies, not with delicate instruments, but with boiling cauldrons of oil, red-hot irons, and saws. Their mission was simple: stop bleeding, prevent infection as best they could, and patch soldiers together well enough to send them back to fight. But their methods were anything but merciful. One common technique involved pouring boiling oil directly into open wounds to seal them. The logic came from a mix of Galenic theory and superstition. Heat was thought to drive out bad humors and prevent poisoned air from entering. The result, however, was unbearable pain and horrific tissue damage. Soldiers often had to be physically restrained by several men as the oil sizzled on their flesh. In some cases, this treatment killed the wounded faster than the injury itself. Iron hooks played another grim role. Arrows and bolts often embedded themselves deep in muscle or bone. Instead of gently extracting them, surgeons would insert iron tools, sometimes resembling large meat hooks, into the wound and rip the projectile out. The tearing caused catastrophic bleeding. If the soldier didn't bleed to death, the wound was usually cauterized with a heated blade immediately afterward, filling the air with the smell of burning flesh. All of this was done without anesthesia. The screams of the wounded could be heard echoing across medieval camps, mingling with the clash of steel and the chants of priests offering last rites. Surgeons themselves were often pragmatic about this cruelty. They saw it not as torture, but as necessity. In their view, agony was a sign that the treatment was working, driving away evil forces that supposedly caused infection and rot. In reality, many of these brutal methods hastened death, but they became deeply embedded in medieval medical culture. Purging the body, emetics, and laxatives. While the previous chapters explored external brutality, internal torture came through purging, forcing the body to vomit or defecate, violently to remove corrupt humors. Medieval physicians saw the body as a vessel that constantly risked imbalance. And the surest way to restore harmony, they believed, was to get rid of its contents violently. Patients were given powerful emetics made from substances like hellebore, antimony, or mixtures of vinegar and herbs designed to induce uncontrollable vomiting. These treatments were administered not only for stomach illnesses, but for fevers, headaches, even melancholy. The logic was simple. If something's wrong, purge everything. Patients often vomited until they were weak, dehydrated, or on the brink of collapse. Laxatives were equally aggressive. Recipes often included crushed beetles, bitter aloe, castor oil, or infusions of poisonous plants. Some were so potent that they caused severe intestinal bleeding, yet doctors praised these violent expulsions as proof of success. The more a patient suffered, the more corruption was thought to be leaving the body. For chronic illnesses, repeated purging sessions were prescribed, sometimes daily for weeks. Patients became frail, malnourished, and sometimes died from dehydration or electrolyte imbalance concepts no one understood at the time. The medieval physician's toolkit was not concerned with comfort. Pain to them was a diagnostic sign and a form of cure. The worse the ordeal, the more thorough the supposed healing, as forced bleeding for mental illness. Mental illness was poorly understood and deeply stigmatized in the Middle Ages. rather than approaching it as a medical or psychological condition, was often interpreted as spiritual corruption, possession, or an imbalance of humors in the brain. One treatment involved forced bleeding, especially from the head, to draw out the excess blood or evil vapors thought to cause insanity. Barber surgeons or physicians would open veins in the forehead, temples, or behind the ears, allowing blood to flow freely. In some cases, they cut deeper to access veins at the base of the skull. For epileptics, trepanation holes were sometimes reopened periodically to let the madness escape. These procedures were incredibly dangerous, often leading to massive blood loss or infection. Patients suffering from mania or melancholy were sometimes tied down while blood was drained over several hours. Their screams were seen as evidence of demons being expelled. Bleeding was sometimes combined with forced purging and prayer, creating a triad of physical torture, spiritual ritual, and medical misunderstanding. These practices highlight a disturbing belief that suffering itself was therapeutic. Medieval physicians believed that the body could be forced back into balance through pain. The mentally ill were often subjected to the harshest of these treatments because they couldn't resist or explain themselves. What was meant as healing often left them permanently weakened or dead. Treatment of the poor versus the nobility. Class determined everything in medieval medicine. The wealthy could afford private physicians, herbal remedies, and careful attention. The poor, by contrast, were treated in overcrowded hospitals, pest houses, or not at all. When they did receive treatment, it was often the most brutal and least effective methods: quick cauterization, mass purges, or experimental surgeries performed by inexperienced practitioners. Nobles received care in their homes, often accompanied by prayer, astrology, and expensive imported medicines like thuriac. Physicians would consult charts and adjust bleeding schedules according to the stars. The poor were lucky if anyone checked their pulse. For them, treatment was frequently reduced to whatever was cheapest and fastest, often a hot iron and a prayer. Monastic hospitals might offer charity, but the care was minimal and focused more on saving souls than healing bodies. Many poor patients were bled, purged, or branded en masse without personalized attention. In contrast, noble patients had their ailments recorded in detail, their treatments tailored, and their suffering minimized, relatively speaking. This divide wasn't just social, it shaped medical theory itself. Treatments that worked at least seemed more effective for the elite, were recorded and refined, while brutal charity medicine for the masses went undocumented, except in the scars it left behind. In medieval medicine, pain was universal, but privilege decided whether that pain came with comfort or cruelty. When healing and torture became indistinguishable, by the late Middle Ages, the line between medicine and torture was so blurred that some treatments were indistinguishable from judicial punishments. Cauterization looked like branding, trepanation resembled interrogation, purges mirrored forced confessions, and asylums resembled prisons. The same instruments could appear in a surgeon's workshop and an executioner's toolkit. This overlap wasn't accidental. Both fields were rooted in the belief that pain revealed truth. In law, it forced confessions. In medicine, it expelled disease. Physicians often believed that if a treatment didn't cause agony, it wasn't working. Patients endured boiling oil, bleeding, branding, vomiting, and cutting, not because physicians were sadists, but because pain was their primary language of healing. Religious influence reinforced this. Suffering was seen as cleansing, aligning the patient's body with Christ's passion. Hospitals were places of piety as much as treatment, and pain became a moral experience. For the sick, there was little distinction between being cured and being punished. Modern medicine emerged not because medieval doctors lacked intelligence, but because eventually observation began to replace inherited dogma. But for centuries, the two were inseparable. Medieval healing wasn't just brutal, it was conceptually fused with torture itself. Early Renaissance challenges to medieval medicine. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe began to stir from the intellectual slumber of the medieval era. The Renaissance was more than just art and architecture. It was a rebirth of curiosity. And nowhere was this more disruptive than in medicine. For centuries, medical practice had been chained to Galen's ancient theories and the Church's dogma. But slowly, brave individuals began to ask dangerous questions. One of the earliest signs of change came from the universities. Scholars, influenced by rediscovered Greek texts and new Arabic translations, started to compare Galen's writings with what they observed in real bodies. Anatomical dissections, once rare and often restricted, began to take place more regularly, especially in Italy. Students packed lecture halls to watch human cadavers being opened, revealing realities that contradicted ancient authorities. For the first time in centuries, observation started to trump unquestioned tradition. Figures like Mondino de Liuzzi and later Andreas Vesalius shattered long-held assumptions. Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica 1543 would famously correct Galen's anatomical errors, which had gone unchallenged for over a millennium. But even before him, Renaissance thinkers were daring to dissect, question, and record their findings systematically. This was dangerous work. Openly contradicting Galen could still bring condemnation or exile. But the intellectual tide was shifting. In medicine, this meant a slow but profound break from the torturous practices justified purely by theory. Surgeons began to refine techniques based on experience rather than astrological charts. Cauterization and bleeding didn't disappear overnight, but physicians increasingly began to question their universal use. The Renaissance didn't instantly heal the wounds of medieval medicine, but it cracked the foundations of unquestioned cruelty. The lingering shadows, when old beliefs refused to die. Despite these intellectual revolutions, medieval medical beliefs didn't simply vanish. Old ideas had deep roots in culture, religion, and daily life. The four humors, for example, continued to dominate medical education well into the 17th century. Physicians still scheduled treatments based on zodiac man diagrams, and bleeding remained a trusted cure for centuries after Vesalius had dissected his first cadaver. Superstition was especially stubborn among the general population. While universities debated anatomy, villagers still turned to charms, herbalists, and astrologers for guidance. A nobleman might consult a physician trained in Padua, but a peasant in rural England still sought out the wise woman who mixed herbal tonics and read the stars. In many ways, two medical worlds coexisted, one increasingly empirical and one deeply medieval. The church, too, maintained its grip. Exorcisms for madness or epilepsy continued, and leper houses functioned well into the Renaissance. In many hospitals, spiritual care remained more important than physical treatment. Pain was still viewed as spiritually meaningful. Suffering patients were encouraged to accept their agony as a pathway to salvation. Even as science progressed, cultural inertia kept torture-like practices alive. This period is fascinating because it reveals just how difficult it is to uproot centuries of belief. Even with new knowledge available, old habits persisted often because they were comforting, familiar, or institutionally entrenched. It would take more than discoveries to undo medieval medicine. It required cultural transformation. Medieval medicine's legacy. Torture disguised as healing. As the medieval era faded, its medical legacy didn't simply disappear, evolved. Many of the instruments and techniques developed during this time laid the groundwork for modern surgical tools. Cauterization became more controlled. Bloodletting transformed from a universal panacea into a targeted procedure, and anatomical study gave birth to modern surgery. But the cultural legacy, the idea that pain itself was healing, echoed for centuries. Even well into the 18th and 19th centuries, practices like purging, bleeding, and blistering persisted, often justified with a veneer of modern reasoning. Patients continued to endure agony in the name of medicine, long after the intellectual basis had been undermined. In this sense, medieval medicine cast a long shadow. Its methods may have been refined, but its underlying assumptions about suffering as cure took generations to dismantle. At the same time, the medieval period forced medicine to confront the consequences of blind faith. The brutality of its treatments became a cautionary tale for later generations. It reminded future physicians of the danger of clinging to dogma at the expense of evidence. Ironically, the same era that inflicted so much pain also set the stage for modern medicine by showing what happens when theory outruns reality. Looking back, medieval medicine seems alien, even horrifying. Boiling oil for wounds, branding for headaches, drilling skulls to release madness. Yet these were not the acts of villains, but of people trying to heal with the tools and beliefs they had. Their world was one where torture and treatment were indistinguishable, because pain itself was their language of medicine. That legacy forces us to ask a haunting question. What practices today will future generations look back on with the same disbelief? And so, our journey through the shadowed corridors of medieval medicine comes to an end. From the whispered prayers of monks hovering over plague victims, to the hiss of hot irons pressed against open wounds, from leeches clinging to flesh, to surgeons carving by candlelight. This was a world where faith often outweighed science, and where pain was both the symptom and the supposed cure. These practices might seem distant and barbaric, but they shaped centuries of medical thought. Their legacy lives on in the instruments we still use, in the language of medicine, and in the cultural belief that suffering somehow purifies. It's a history written not in ink, but in blood, fire, and fear. If this deep dive into the brutal reality of medieval healing fascinated you, then don't stop here. The past is full of hidden horrors, strange rituals, and forgotten truths waiting to be unearthed. Yes. Subscribe to keep exploring the bizarre corners of history that most textbooks ignore. Like this video if you found yourself horrified, intrigued, or both. And share it with anyone who still thinks the good old days were truly good. History isn't always noble. Sometimes it's nightmarish. And that's exactly why it's worth remembering.